From The Times and The Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Luke Jones. Today in Paris, a metaphorical political guillotine is being dusted off yet again. The current Prime Minister, President Emmanuel Macron's sixth, is facing a motion of no confidence in the National Assembly after quite the uproar over his proposed budget. If you're thinking to yourself, isn't that exactly what happened at the end of last year? Then yes, you're right, it did. Why? Well, our man in France will explain. The story today is France's government on the brink of collapse again.
My name's Peter Conradi. I'm based in Paris as Europe editor of the Sunday Times.
The roots, Peter, of this latest French political crisis are somewhat in all the hilarious business that happened in 2024 when Macron called a snap election, which we now know to have been quite disastrous. Why did he do that then?
He did that then essentially because he thought France was becoming ungovernable. There had been elections a few days earlier to the European Parliament, which the far-right National Rally Party of Marine Le Pen had won. And he looked at the existing parliament, which had been elected 2 years before that, in 2022. He said, this no longer kind of represents the will of the people. We've got to have fresh elections. But, he called those elections hoping that the pro-Macron forces were going to win and were going to get a majority. In fact, they didn't. They ended up with fewer seats than they'd had before. The National Rally didn't get a majority either. The left didn't get a majority. All they ended up with was a hung parliament, which has been causing problems for him and successive prime ministers ever since.
And you say successive prime ministers. I mean, just two being felled in 2024 alone.
We now have a new prime minister here in France. It's 34-year-old Gabriel Attal, the former education minister, who's now making history as the youngest prime minister in the Fifth Republic.
French Prime Minister Gabriel Attal has just arrived at the Élysée Palace, in fact, to hand in his resignation.
Breaking news, Emmanuel Macron has appointed Michel Barnier as his new prime minister.
Yeah, people very upset about that. Demonstrations taking place all over France, 130 different locations.
Michel Barnier has been brought down by a parliamentary vote. The first time that a French Prime Minister has been brought down by a parliamentary vote in this country since 1962. He becomes the shortest serving Prime Minister of the Fifth Republic of France, which began in 1958.
And so we're now on to what could be the fifth Prime Minister in 2 years if things go badly this afternoon.
It's almost British, isn't it?
Indeed.
So Macron came out of that snap election last year quite badly. Why was that? Is it about him? Is it about the economy?
It is a fundamental economic problem that France has got, which is that France, for years and years and years, like most Western countries, has been living beyond its means. The French haven't had a balanced budget since 1974. The national debt has been going up and up and up. The deficit, i.e. the difference between what the government earns in terms of taxes and what it spends each year, has also been rising, is completely out of control. And, there is a perception among the ruling classes in France that the country cannot go on like that. The problem is there's no agreement on how you're going to deal with the problem, whether you're going to raise taxes, which is really very, very difficult indeed, because, the French state is already enormous. Something like 57% of GDP is spent by the government compared to, I think, just 44% in Britain. So there's a huge state sector. So therefore, if you can't raise any more in tax, then you need to cut spending, which is always controversial because there's always someone who's going to oppose whatever it was you want to cut.
And we did have previous prime ministers last year in France, people like Michel Barnier, try and have a stab at getting on top of that problem. Why has that eluded them?
It's eluded them because it is just so difficult, as the government has found in Britain, to cut spending, because for every pound of spending you cut on social programs or on administration even, or anything else, there is always someone who's going to be unhappy. People are happy to cut waste because that's a sort of, everyone can be agreed that they're opposed to waste. But when it comes to, cutting down on education or social services or benefits, the aggrieved groups will come forward and they will protest and they will object. And the problem is especially acute in France because the French state is so well developed. It does so much. People have come to expect so much from the state that any kind of cut in entitlement is a shock to them. And also because there are so many different political forces with different ideas, all representing kind of slightly different groups of society who are all ready to be aggrieved and upset and fight against any kind of cut that impacts on them.
The latest Prime Minister, at time of recording, is a chap called François Bayrou. What do we know of him?
He is a centrist politician. He's 74, so he's been around for a very, very long time in French politics. He's the head of a small group called Modem, which sits in the French Parliament. He's sympathetic to Macron. He's not a kind of not subordinate to Macron, as it were. His party was always sort of independent of Macron's. But when Michel Barnier, the previous Prime Minister and the former Brexit negotiator, fell over a vote of confidence over the budget last year, and Macron was looking around, he came up with Bayrou as a replacement, and he thought, okay, this is a very, very seasoned politician. He's sort of slightly left of centre probably, but he can do a deal with different forces within Parliament. And he survived for a few months, which in French terms is pretty good going at the moment. But he's come up against the real problem, which is getting through a budget. And it's very clear that the budget, as he's proposed it, is not going to get through. And so he has kind of thrown down the gauntlets to his opponents. And he said, we can't go on like this. France is drowning in debt. We've got to do something. So, it's a kind of a put up or shut up. And that's why we've got this vote of confidence today.
In the 13 days ahead, the French people will choose. They will influence their elected representatives to decide whether they position themselves on the side of chaos or on the side of conscience and responsibility.
And before we get to that, is there anything different in his prescription to cure this problem to Barnier or any of the previous prime ministers who tried to deal with this? Is there anything different he's doing, or is it just more of the same?
In a sense, he's not saying anything particularly different from what Michel Barnier said in the need to save money. But the difference, I think, is that he has come up with a concrete figure. He said, essentially, we have got to save 44 billion euros every year from the government budget. Now, that's not a huge amount. That's about 5% or so of the budget. But, he's kind of coupled this with a very, very strong message that at the end of last week, he was sort of touring the television studios, the radio studios, repeating this message, we can't go on like this. He's coupled this also with slightly curious attempt to blame the baby boomers. He's kind of said, his generation, he's in his mid-70s and those in their 60s, their 50s, who have done very, very well over the years, during which France has been living beyond its means, and that in a sense, this debt is something that they're inflicting on young people. This is quite an interesting kind of tactic to blame a whole kind of generation. It's raised quite a lot of eyebrows because, in fact, his natural electorate and Macron's natural electorate are the baby boomers. If you look demographically, the people that vote for the centre parties are predominantly the over 50s, over 60s, and so on. So it's gone down a bit like a lead balloon with them. Has it particularly appealed to young people in France? No, not particularly, because they tend to vote either for the sort of left, far left, or indeed for the National Rally on the right. So that's added an extra degree of acrimony to the whole thing, which is not making his life any easier.
Are there any specific measures or cuts or things that he's wanted to get rid of that have become particularly inflammatory.
If we look at the cuts, there have been, the usual kind of attempts to slightly put up the cost of medical charges, which are very generously subsidized by the state here, various other kind of attempts to cut waste and so on. But the thing that has really antagonized people here is the idea that the French must give up 2 public holidays a year. I mean, in a sense, if you want...
I can hear the listeners' eyes rolling.
Exactly.
Even long distance.
Exactly. If you wanted to upset a people that get very, very easily upset, and you wanted to kind of choose some symbol that even the person who is least engaged in politics would actually know, understand, recognize, and realize it would have a direct impact on them, it is you would say to them, you've got to work 2 more days a year. So this has been absolutely disastrous politically. And, you can see in the opinion polls how public support has gone down almost directly in response to this call.
So as you say, the Prime Minister has thrown down the gauntlet and said, right, we're having a confidence motion today, as a matter of fact. How have the other parties responded? Have they said, well, yes, we'll get rid of you?
Essentially, yes. I mean, it's as simple as that. I mean, it was very clear that the National Rally were not going to support him. It was clear also that the far left were not going to support him. The pathway to getting a majority in the vote today would have been to win over the support of the socialists, who are sort of moderately left-wing in the current kind of French political context. There have been meetings with them. There were hopes on Bayrou's part that he would be able to persuade them at least to abstain rather than to vote against him. But it's looking very, very unlikely that they will do so, and it's looking very, very probable that he will fall.
And what does that mean?
That means essentially that Emmanuel Macron, who is sort of presiding over everything as the head of state, must take a very difficult decision. He must either try and find another prime minister who will have the confidence of the current parliament, which is going to be a very, very difficult task indeed, or he can say, look, I'm not going to find anyone. We're going to have another election. And he can dissolve the parliament. He could call another election, which would happen probably relatively quickly, perhaps by the end of month, early next month. But, is that going to solve any of the problems? Probably not. I mean, the expectation is that parliament would come back equally divided, with Macron's own forces having probably fewer seats than they've got at the moment. And Macron, has made clear that that's not something he wants to do. But, who knows, a few weeks down the line, if he still hasn't found a replacement prime minister, it's something he might be obliged to do.
Do Marine Le Pen's National Rally or the far left, do they have any different or convincing spin on this? I mean, what is their pitch? Because surely it's the same issue. Anyone in office would have to cut spending some way. Is it just about how you cut it?
It is. I mean, they essentially are opposed to any increase in taxes, because part of Bayrou's package is also some tax increases. They've not been entirely clear on what they would do to cut spending, apart from to spend less on immigrants. As one can imagine, the whole subject of immigration in France is as hot button an issue as it is in Britain. There is the perception that too much money is being spent on immigrants here, on sort of housing them, on providing various benefits for them and so on. And they've also spoken more generally about reducing France's contributions to the EU. I mean, good luck with that. So, I think the fundamental problem is that no one's figures really add up. Probably except for Bayrou's, but they add up only because they are just so politically unpopular.
And what of the French, Peter? I mean, all those people out there in La France Profonde, I mean, how are they feeling about all of this?
Well, they're getting quite angry in a lot of cases, as we could see this coming week.
Peter, we're talking about the latest French political farce to descend on Paris. But as you mentioned a moment ago, this could also spill out into the streets around the country. There are some enormous protests planned. What are we to expect? Is it going to be barricades, people with enormous tricolours, waving them over the top? What are we expecting?
Well, what we've been seeing over the past few months is sort of unrest bubbling on social media, on the internet, whatever. It's quite amorphous. There are a number of different people involved, kind of voicing discontent of different sorts. Essentially, it seems to be two kind of different channels. One of them are a group called the Essentials. They want to change the system as it is. They're not happy with the elites. They're not happy with politicians, with political parties. It's a sort of traditional grassroots. We citizens have to decide everything ourselves. We want to do everything by referendum and so on. They're one element. They came up with the idea of having a day of protest on September the 10th, on Wednesday. This kind of began gathering steam on the web. Another group, whose name translates as Let's Be Indignant, who are much more far left, have also piled in. They also want to have a big day of action on the 10th. I mean, quite what will happen is not clear, because the Essentials people, they don't want to march. They want to stay at home. They want to sort of do a kind of a self-lock-in, but they want to do a consumer boycott. They don't want to use their bank cards. They want to, just kind of
sort of an all-encompassing strike, essentially.
Sort of a consumer strike, basically. So they want that. You have the other lot, the Let's Be Indignant, who want to show quite how indignant they are by taking to the streets, by marching. These two groups are sort of relatively antagonistic towards each other. So it's very difficult to know what will come of this movement. The reason people are worried about it is because everyone here remembers the so-called gilets jaunes, the yellow vests, which was a movement that also started in a very similar kind of way.
Well, turning now to Paris, where police have again been firing tear gas and water cannon as yellow vest protesters ignited fires and ransacked shops. They're the most violent street clashes in Paris since December of last year. This is now the fourth month of demonstrations by a loose coalition of activists, unions, and citizens.
They were organizing demonstrations, they were blocking traffic, they were standing around at roundabouts, causing enormous disruption. Came almost completely out of nowhere. And in the back of everyone's mind, especially the security services, is the expectation that this movement could grow in the same way and could prove equally disruptive, precisely at a time when France does not need it.
Quite. And you've actually met one of the sort of protest organisers, am I right? Who was that, and what did you make of them?
I did indeed. No, I went last week up to a place called Morbecque, which is just a little village of about 2,000 people near the Belgian border. And there's a guy called Julien Marissot, who was kind of holding court in a café.
Macron s'en fiche de tout aujourd'hui, et encore plus des citoyens français. Lui, il est là pour plaire à ses pairs.
He started this movement in conjunction with a woman called Christelle, who wouldn't give her surname, whom we met on the internet a couple of months ago. And they came up with this group, The Essentials. And he set out his views to me. And I was saying to him, well, this sounds terribly utopian.
Ah, ça devrait pas être un métier aujourd'hui. Non. En politique, c'est servir la population. Oui.
I mean, it's an idea that you just pay the politicians less and somehow all the country's economic problems will be solved. But this is not stopping his movement from attracting a lot of support.
One thing that is clear, I guess, it seems from your telling, is that Bayrou will be out of a job. What do you think will happen next? Are we just going to be back on this ludicrous merry-go-round of trying to find a new prime minister all the way until Macron is out of office, which is what, spring 27?
Yes. I suspect that Macron won't dissolve the parliament. He's said that he won't, and Bayrou also has said that he doesn't think he will. So I think, for Macron, the best response will be to find another prime minister, if Bayrou, as expected, does go today. The smart money suggests that he will try and get someone from the socialists who are sort of moderately left. He wants to basically peel the sort of the softer left away from the hard left, because if you have the soft left, you have the Macron supporters, and you have some of the kind of the centre right, that gives you just enough probably for an absolute majority. They will do some reforms. I'm sure they will make some cuts, but they, by definition, won't make nearly as many cuts to the budget as Bayrou wanted to do, which will then leave France's economic situation, which is really at the heart of all this, in the same state as it is at the moment, or in not much of an improved state as it is at the moment.
But just finally, how much do you think the logjam is about differences of opinion on economics and how to get the country back on track, and how much is a sort of cross-party loathing of Macron?
I think one shouldn't underplay the economics. I mentioned that a lot during this conversation, but that is the fundamental problem, because if money needs to be saved necessarily, there are going to be different groups who are going to have different ideas about it. But Macron's deep unpopularity certainly doesn't help. I mean, he is widely loathed across the political sphere, also by the public, despite the fact that they re-elected him 3 years ago. But then even if Macron were to say tomorrow that he was going to step down and were to call new presidential elections, which he could do, but he's under no obligation what to do, how will one then come up with a figure who would unite the country? It will be very, very difficult indeed, because there is such a wide gulf, I think, these days between the far right under Marine Le Pen, the left, which is increasingly the far left under Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who's a kind of French Jeremy Corbyn, the kind of the traditional, what we sort of had in France since the late 50s and the founding by General de Gaulle of the Fifth Republic was a kind of an alternance between left and right, much as there used to be in Britain between just Labour, Conservative, and so on. And, the whole political situation has become much, much more complicated, in a sense, partly due to Macron, who emerged in the middle, who kind of destroyed the traditional party system. So the idea that you can get a majority of people behind any candidate these days in France is just looking increasingly implausible.
That was Peter Conradi, Europe editor for The Times and The Sunday Times. There is plenty more from him and the results and consequences of that no confidence vote today at thetimes.com. That is it from us. Today's producer was Edith Rousselot. The executive producer was Kate Lamble. Sound design was by David Crackles. And theme composition was by Mao Lassetto. I'm Luke Jones. See you soon.